Hello, everyone, and welcome to the new data questions for intake. This is Elizabeth Perez from All Chicago, and I am joined by Sal Munoz from the HMIS team. And also on the line, we have Beth Horowitz from Chapin Hall. So we'd like to thank you all for joining us today for this presentation regarding some new youth data questions that are being proposed by the Youth Data Work Group. We are in a webinar, and this webinar is also being recorded, so just a few housekeeping before we start into the content. Everyone is muted, so if you do have a question while we're going through the presentation, feel free to type it out in the chat box. If we have some time, we'll open it up. We'll open up the lines and call upon you if you want to raise your hand and ask a question. But if it's during the webinar, you can feel free to type it in the chat box and we'll read it out loud and provide a response. Great. So we'll go ahead and move on. So we're here just to talk about some new proposed questions that the Youth Data Work Group has come together. So the Youth Data Work Group is made of representation from Chapin Hall, All Chicago, DFSS, La Casa Norte, Center on Hosted, Social Impact, and Urban Labs. And also our Youth Action Board members. So we've been meeting for a few months now to take a look at the data and trying to help us understand how our young people that are experiencing homelessness navigate our system. So we came together and identified some questions, and I will turn it over to Beth to talk a little bit more regarding how we got there and the actual questions that we are looking to adding into the intake assessment.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth, and good morning, everyone. Elizabeth, I may be the only one, but I don't yet see the PowerPoint slides. I'm not sure if you've started sharing your screen or not.
Thank you. All right.
There we go. So if you want to jump ahead to the third slide. Okay. So here's a bit of an overview of what we'll be talking about. So first, a bit of explanation of why are we adding additional questions, why these ones, and how these questions were developed. Then we'll walk you through what the exact questions are. And then Sal will give a bit of an overview on the rollout in HMIS and the impact to data quality, as well as timeline information. Next slide. Is it advanced? It's not showing on mine that it moved. There we go. So just as one caveat for folks, these questions are coming from the youth work group. They're not a part of the HUD data standards that will be going into effect October 1st. The HUD data standards are mandated and so have to be included and everyone has to adhere to, but these questions are really about system improvement and thinking about youth experiencing homelessness, but they are not part of the HUD data standards. So, that really raises the question of why are we doing this? Chapin Hall has been working with the youth sector to better understand young people who experience homelessness in Chicago. And so to do that, we began to analyze the existing HMIS data. So unfortunately, though, what we found is that we're not collecting information consistently from every young person, so that if young people engage differently in our system, we have different information about them. Some of this stems from different types of programs to ask different questions, but also that funders are requiring questions in some programs, and then if you're not funded by that program, you're not asking the questions. And so we have huge variability in the type of information that we have about young people accessing our system. So it makes it really hard to understand whether or not we're serving young people consistently or equitably in our system, or if the issue is we have one group of youth that gets into housing and different youth who only engage with emergency shelter, and some youth that go into adult programs and different youth that go into adult and family programs. And we just don't know because we don't have consistent information about all of them. So on the next slide. Because of this inconsistency, and also we wanted to bring Chicago's system in line with the federal government's framework for ending youth homelessness, we identified questions to add, and they fall into the categories within the framework for ending youth homelessness of stable housing, permanent connections, education, employment, and then social emotional well-being is also part of the framework, but we as a group weren't sure how to best measure and track social emotional well-being, so we've not added any questions regarding this topic yet, because we wanted to make sure that we were adding just the questions we needed to, and in the way we needed to. Next slide. So a little bit about the context. As Elizabeth had shared, the Youth Data Work Group has been focused on this, and we developed these questions as a group that's made up of providers, researchers, Youth Action Board members, HMIS, and the Youth Project Managers. And they're informed by also literature reviews and other analysis of what research tells us are the best way to ask certain questions. And in addition to the work group's input, we gathered additional input from young people with lived experience through a focus group and then targeted staff outreach. Next slide. When we were developing the questions, we thought a lot about how to ensure that we were not improving data quality in Chicago and not making it more complicated. So we tried to use questions that were already in place wherever that made sense. So if, say, a small number of young people were being asked a question about education, we tried to mirror the question as we thought about how it would get rolled out for this system. So as we're going through the questions, you may recognize a version of the questions that are being used either in some of the assessments that your agency uses for housing or that are being used elsewhere in your agency, particularly if you work at a program that targets young people experiencing homelessness. We also looked at funder required questions and the existing program intake forms for all the youth programs. And as I mentioned, also the research literature, all of which was done with the hopes of picking the best questions and the ones that fit most seamlessly into our system. So with all of that context, we'll move into what the proposed questions are. And I'll say that there is also a PDF available to download that outlines these questions if you're interested and are part of the webinar. So the questions fall into, as we talked about, so there were those outcome areas from the federal framework. Stable housing, we felt like there were already good questions to cover that. So there aren't any new questions for stable housing. Similarly, as I mentioned, we're not adding any questions related to social emotional well-being because we weren't really sure, which leaves us then with questions around education, employment, and permanent connections. And then there's also some questions about pregnancy and parenthood, because we know from Chicago's data that we have a large number of young people who are pregnant or parenting, both young people who identify as female as well as our male identified youth. And so wanting to make sure that we were capturing that information consistently as well. So in the next slide, first we'll look at the proposed questions on education. And those, there are going to be 3 of them. One is, are you currently enrolled in school? And then it explains that it could be an education or training program. Yes or no. Are you attending school regularly? Again, sort of with the clarification of what we mean by school. Again, yes, no, or then not enrolled. And you'll see in some of these questions where, because of the nature of our HMIS system, we can't use something called skip logic that would say, like, if you answered a question a certain way, then you do or do not answer the next one. And so for that reason, are you attending school regularly has a not enrolled option because if you'd said you're not enrolled to the question before, how could you possibly be attending school regularly? And so there's an option of an answer choice to say you're not enrolled, so that folks can provide an answer to all of the questions. And then the last of the education questions asks about highest level of education completed. And again, very important information for us to understand young people's educational experiences, and make sure that we're monitoring and paying attention to this, because we know there's a very high correlation between education and homelessness. So those are all the education questions. Next, we turn to employment questions. For employment, sort of you'll see similarly the options to ensure that folks can answer all of these questions, even if an earlier one would suggest you wouldn't have an answer to subsequent ones. So the first one is, are you currently employed? You see that it's very similar to the education one, and again, provides the definition of what employed means. Then how many hours do you work in a typically week? Again, with that option to say not employed. And then on the next two slides, do you have a disability or health condition that limits your ability to work? As well as, are you currently looking for work? We, as a group, felt it was really important to understand for those young people who maybe weren't employed, what some of the reasons might be behind that, so we could understand if, for example, 60% of young people are unemployed, it would maybe raise the question of, are they unemployed because they can't find a job? Are they unemployed because they're unable to work? Or are they unemployed for sort of larger barriers that young people might encounter? And so wanted to bring a little bit more nuance in to those questions. Next, we turn to permanent connections. For this, there's just one question. And it asks young people to rank how much they agree or disagree with the statement of, there are people I can depend on to help me if I really need it. This, as with all the questions we're proposing, are all based on a young person's self-report. So they would get to interpret this question and provide their answer. But again, trying to get to the question of whether young people have other folks to turn to. And then lastly, we get to the questions on pregnancy and parenthood. Are you currently pregnant or have a pregnant partner? Are you a parent? And then do any of your children live with you? Wanting to then understand whether they're with you full time, yes, some of the time, or no, they don't. And those are all of our questions. I'll now turn it over to Sal to talk a bit about the rollout in HMIS.
So what I wanted to re-emphasize again is that these questions are not part of the HMIS data standards updates. So they are going to be rolled out on October 1st as well, along with the intake documentation that we're going to be rolling out. But it is not going to be on the same level of being mandated that the HUD data standards have. So let's talk a little bit about where these questions currently are, or rather what versions of these questions currently exist in the system, and then we'll talk a little bit about what weight it'll have with your data quality and any other issues regarding HMIS. So I wanted to present this really quickly just to show you where these questions are currently alluded to in HMIS. So on the rows, I have the various assessments that we have in the system, starting out with the annual assessment that should be familiar to most PSH projects. Then we have the path entry assessment that PATH projects use, as well as the RI assessment that most RI projects use. Then we have the typical assessments that most emergency shelters or PSH projects utilize. Finally, we're ending it off with SSVF and some of the youth provider assessments that we have. And you'll see that throughout this, it's inconsistent in terms of how we're asking the questions. But you'll also notice that on several, the main sources where this information is being collected are those assessments that are designated to the youth providers. So the RI entry and the youth provider assessments are all assessments that youth providers use, but you could see that the majority of the other agencies that serve the general public or don't have youth concentration, they're not collecting this information at all. And even those assessments like the DFSS and IDHS supplemental, while they ask questions about pregnancy, the only question they're asking is, are you pregnant? Yes or no, and that's it. Nothing about parenthood, nothing about an expected partner. So it's not the full kind of information that we would want to do the type of analysis that Beth and Liz were talking about and that the youth data work group wants in order to improve their services to the general community. So what will happen is that these assessments will eventually be updated with all these questions, and we'll have a consistent slate of questions that we're collecting in the community. So moving on. There we go. So let's talk a little bit about the impact to data quality, how you'll have to measure this, how you have to collect this. So these questions won't be weighed for data quality yet. Now, it can be presented to the HMI, the data quality work group, which would then go into the HMIS committee in order to bring these bring a measurement of these questions into the data quality plan. But that is not, that would take a quarter or two to go into effect. So just understand that if, we want your staff to be ready for these questions, we want your staff to be, we're encouraging you to have your staff ask these questions because they're relatively straightforward and they're questions that are, they are questions that can benefit anyone, but they will be in italics so that it's apparent to you that these questions, while they are added there, they'll be on all the assessments. They will not yet be required. They'll be encouraged for general population and then strongly encouraged for youth. But just know that we'll have a sort of marker to help you recognize that these are the questions that are generated from the youth data work group. But again, these are good questions to ask. They're going to be in our intake. They're going to be a part of our materials. So we highly encourage the general population to use them, highly encourage our partners to use these questions and answer them. And so that's it for my part. In terms of a rollout from HMIS, again, we'll have these questions present on present on a universal intake, as well as a majority of the entry assessments in HMIS and the update and exit assessments as well.
Great. Thanks, Sal. So I think since we have some time, we can open up the lines for any questions that individuals may have. So now that we have both Beth and Sal here, we can really speak to any questions that you may have in the back of your mind now that you've heard about the new questions that we are proposing. Again, we are creating an alignment to ensure that we understand that many of the service providers are relooking at their intake forms and processes as the new HUD data standards roll out. So we just want to make sure that we are incorporating these questions as well. So that way, come a couple months down the road, you're not expected to update those same paperwork and retrain your intake workers and so forth. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to raise your hand through the chat box option. You would be required to have a working mic, or if you're joining via phone, you can feel free to ask your question that way. Once you raise your hand, I'll unmute you and you'll be able to ask your question live on the air. If not, if let's say you are in front of a computer and your mic does not work, you can also feel free to use the chat box to submit your question. As we're saying that, we do know that a few individuals may have not had the opportunity to join us today just due to prior commitments, or maybe you may have some colleagues that are working in the evening and just don't have the opportunity to join us this early in the morning. This webinar is being recorded and will be available by the end of this week on the All Chicago website. So we do have a page dedicated through the action agenda for the youth homelessness. And we do have a blurb about what the Youth Data Work Group does and our dates that we do meet. We meet twice a month. So this webinar will be posted there. And we'll also share this via the Chicago Task Force on Homeless Youth listserv, so that way if people want the ability to view that link, we'll make sure that we make it available so people have the opportunity to view this webinar. But in the event that you think of some questions down the road, you can always feel free to contact us at cocprograms@allchicago.org. This is a shared email inbox that the entire COC team shares, but we just like to put that email address out so that way we ensure that we have a response in a timely fashion to you. So any questions regarding these new youth intake questions will be channeled to myself, and if needed, I will bring in Sal if it's very specific to the HMIS kind of layout. So feel free to also email us through that way, and we'll make sure that we have a response to you. All right. So it doesn't seem like we have any questions. Beth, I don't know if you have any last minute thoughts or comments you'd like to share?
The only thing I would add is, sort of thinking ahead, what are we going to do with this information? I guess as the added context, we'll say, once we have enough information about young people across the variety of types of programs, we'll be able to begin analyzing the information to understand what's happening, right? Sort of to better understand who young people are that access our system and any differences that might exist between who gets access to what kinds of programs, or whether we need to be sort of delving yet deeper to understand the differential needs of, say, young people who access adult programs but don't access youth programs, or young people who only access emergency shelter and then never access housing, and what's going on there. And that is the beginning of us understanding really what young people need from our system, and how we can better provide the right distribution of services and the right kinds of services to meet young people's needs, to ensure that youth homelessness becomes rare, brief, and one time, in line with sort of all of our hopes and expectations for young people. So the Youth Data Work Group, I'm sure, will have information a number of months from now, but once data has been collected, but information to share about what we're learning from these new questions. So thank you all for helping us to better understand young people and continue to improve our system.
Yeah. Thanks, Beth. And I think, as part of like the Youth Data Work Group, if this is something that you have a strong desire to learn more, once we collect all this information and begin to analyze it, please feel free to join us. We are more than happy to have new members share and look at data with us to really help us understand how our young people are navigating our system and ensure that we build a system that meets their needs. All right, so I don't have any questions. So with that, I thank all of you for joining us this morning. And again, if you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to us, and we'll make sure that you also have access to this link, and we'll also post out the handout. So thank you all for joining us this morning.